All right, good afternoon, everyone. Welcome back. Hope you guys are doing good. We have 4 minutes until 2:30, but I'm just getting the stream established a few minutes early. Welcome back, though, and I hope you guys are doing good. Yeah, about 4 minutes. Hi there, David, Tina, Nicholas. Awesome, good to see you guys. Hey, AJ. Hi, Moises, Brandon. Good to see everybody here. And hey, Sarah. Just hanging in there for another couple minutes. I don't know if you guys have more classes today. This is my last meeting of the day, so after this, get a little time to chill, maybe go do a little workout or something. Yeah, so good question, David. The format for the exams, it's going to be written response. You're going to have to write paragraphs and basically answer a question. Like, I'm going to give you a big study guide with all of the possible questions on it, but like, what if I asked you right now, explain the ontological argument? How would you explain it? That would be your answer. Stuff like that. No, there won't be no multiple choice. Hey, Spencer. Hey, Alan. Hi, Ruby. I'm having a good one, Anthony. Thanks. Hope you are too. Yeah, no problem. Thanks for the question. Hey, Maria and Alicia. Hi, Catherine. Hey there, Daniel. Mia, good to see you too. Just another minute. Hi, Sylvia. Hello, Emily. Hi, Annalie. Hey, Angelina. How's it going? Hi, Gabby, Summer, Kristen. Nice. Okay, everybody. Well, it's now pretty much 2:30. Hey, Carson. And so, yeah, just going to get things started. Welcome back, everyone. Hope you've been having a good week and a nice Wednesday. It's hump day, as they say, so we're almost over that hump. Just so everyone knows, we do have a holiday on Monday. It's President's Day, so we will be back after today in 1 week. And also this weekend, I'm going to distribute the first essay prompt, which is going to be due not until week 6. So just hold on for that, and afterwards we'll discuss it in the meeting when we return on Wednesday. It's just going to be a 3 to 4 page typed essay on reporting on some of these different arguments for God's existence. More details to follow, but just keeping your mind on the calendar that I'll send it off this weekend, and then you'll have about 2 weeks to work on it. So just looking forward to that. And everyone here, I see you guys in the chat. Appreciate you for being here. go ahead, and if you haven't been able to yet, say hi, to make sure that you do record your attendance with a quick comment of whatever kind. And if you need to put your name in the comment just so I know what it is in case your screen name is different, then just do that. But anyway, yeah. So those are just a couple of brief announcements. I mean, these are all things that I just want us to be aware of, that we have a first essay that's going to be distributed, the prompt this weekend, and then we have 2 weeks to work on it. After that, we'll look forward to the midterm, but obviously you're just supposed to keep reading through all the essays on the list and taking your good notes and attending. So, okay, guys, so let's just go back to where we were last time and then continue. We were in the middle of the work of Ernest Nagel. Ernest Nagel's article was called "Does God Exist?" Okay, and so basically what he's doing in this paper is trying to show criticisms of all the different available arguments, or many of them anyway, for the existence of God. So he started his discussion and commentary with a criticism of the cosmological argument. Okay, so as I refer you to his criticisms, I'll briefly re-summarize the argument itself. The cosmological argument, you now know, is the one that says everything exists based on having a cause. If something exists, there had to be a cause for it. The case of the sphere was given in Taylor's presentation of it, but just as much as the sphere, anything else has to have a cause. There are contingent and then there are necessary truths. Contingent truths depend on something else, and they didn't need to have happened. They could have been false, possibly. And then necessary truths are things that are true but could not possibly be false. So the claim is then that the universe, of course, exists and it's contingent. And since it's contingent, the principle of sufficient reason says that it has to have some cause or some explanation. But what could that be? Well, it can't cause itself. And the argument says that you can't have an infinite regress of contingent causes that never starts anywhere. So the only possible answer to how could the universe be caused by something is if it was caused by something that's not contingent. In other words, something that's necessary, and that would be the necessary being, the creator, God. So God is not dependent on anything else, not contingent on anything else, but everything that does exist, the universe and all things within it, come from God. They're contingent on him. He's contingent on nothing. So there's no infinite regress, and God is the first mover. Okay, so that's the cosmological argument. Now, Nagel said, I don't find this to be a good argument, and why not? One thing he says to criticize it is, how do we really know that everything has to have a cause? I mean, it seems like it, but couldn't it be possible that there are some things that don't have a cause? Well, say that everything has to have a cause. Another problem then is this. Why wouldn't God have to have one then? How can it be consistent to insist that everything has a cause, including the universe, but God doesn't have one? If everything has to have a cause, simply stated, why doesn't God have to have a cause? Hey, Ricardo. Another problem mentioned after that is this. If God could have no cause, if there could be a being that's necessary, that's uncaused, then how come the universe couldn't just be this necessary being that's not in need of a cause? In that case, there would be no need to assume the existence of something separate from it that brings it into being. And then another final issue was this. Is it really so impossible for there to be an infinite regress? Maybe it isn't impossible. If you think about mathematics like the number line, or you think about geometry like the points that lie on the geometric line, it seems that there's an infinity of intermediate values between even the two closest points. So maybe this is a way of comprehending the actual infinite density of the timeline of history. So those are problems with cosmological. Then he talked about the ontological, and he said his issue there is the same as G.E. Moore, that it's not correct to say that existence is a predicate. Well, a predicate is a feature or an attribute, and so in other words, this objection is saying that existence is not an attribute or a feature of something. And that's supposed to attack Anselm's argument, because in his argument he says that a perfect being couldn't lack for any qualities that are good qualities. So existence being one of them, he would have to have it too. But now G.E. Moore and Ernest Nagel are saying that it's not really a predicate, it's not really an attribute. Ernest Nagel's example had to do with the $100 bill, if you remember. He said, say that a person has a $100 bill with them, or they don't have it with them. Whether they have it or not, the definition of that kind of currency is the same. So whether a thing exists or not is completely unrelated to what its defining traits are. I offered you a slightly modified example that I think makes the point even clearer, which was about dinosaurs. The definition of that life form will be the same, whether they're extinct or whether they're revived from extinction like Jurassic Park. So existence or non-existence is unrelated to their essential definition. Therefore, existence is not a predicate. Okay, and then last, there was the criticism of the design argument. The design argument is the one that based off of the example of a watch being found somewhere like on the forest floor. And the takeaway was that you already know the watch has to have a creator that has intelligence because there's nothing else that could have produced the watch. It can't come about through randomness. And why is that obvious? Because it tells time, and it has to have all these parts that are so specifically put together so that it can tell time. It seems like there's no accidental or just random way that that could have possibly fallen into place. Just like this computer that you're watching the lecture on. I think we can all agree that that computer there, or phone if you're using that, or tablet, whatever, there's no way that that could have just spontaneously generated from randomness in nature. There has to be someone building a computer, assembling the parts so that it produces all of its function. Okay, so if something has a function or purpose, it has to have a creator. The design argument then applies that principle to the works of nature. And it says that in nature, we see the eye, we see the ear, we see the wings of the bird, or we could go on and on. And all those things have function, purpose, and very complex inner workings of parts. So shouldn't they have to have an intelligent designer too, like we said about the watch? It seems like it, so that's what Paley thinks, and that's why he concludes that God is like the watchmaker of nature. The criticism of this from Ernest Nagel was twofold. First, he says that, look, we know the watch has a maker, okay, yes, but it's not really because it has a function, though. It's simply because we are humans that make watches, so definitely we know that they're man-made, that they're created by something. And then when we switch to the other example of the eye that's being compared with the watch, though the eye has a function, the function that it does have can be explained without assuming any intelligent designer. And this natural hypothesis that explains that would be evolution. So he says, if we can explain the purpose of nature with evolution, and if the knowledge that things that are man-made hasn't really got anything to do with their function, then the analogy between the watch and the eye seems to kind of fall apart, and there's no real reason to suppose that things in nature have to be made by an intelligent creator, like a watch. Okay, so that was the summary, I guess, just to start our meeting today, just to kind of remind you of what Nagel was saying as we closed the lecture last time. But there's a little more from Ernest Nagel, so I want to fully complete the presentation of his paper. And that means that I have to tell you about a couple of other miscellaneous arguments for God's existence that he talks about just after that. Okay, and to those that have just arrived, hi guys, it's good to see you, Jack and Kim and everybody else. But so here's what I was saying. There are these three big arguments for God's existence that we've now fully reviewed: ontological, cosmological, and design. And I feel that those are kind of the biggest, most prominent three arguments. But there are some other kind of like side arguments for God's existence that have maybe not achieved the same popularity or prominence, but they're important too. And Ernest Nagel in his paper, he also wants to call those out for criticism. So there's a few more that we are briefly going to mention. This is Ernest Nagel still. We're still finishing his paper. And if you remember, it's called Does God Exist from 1959. Okay, Ernest Nagel's paper, Does God Exist, 1959. And we're at the point of his paper now where we're looking at some miscellaneous arguments for God's existence. These are just other assorted arguments, less prominent than the big three, but also to be discussed, and in his essay, criticized. So let me label them and then explain them briefly what they're all about. Another possible argument for God's existence is the argument from the unfairness of the world without God. So I'll call this argument from unfairness. So here's how this argument goes, and it's not as, I think, well received as the others, because it's just not really as high quality of an argument. There's some obvious flaws that it has, but we want to still know what it is. So here's how it basically goes. It can be stated simply. It's just this idea that if God did not exist, then the universe that we are in would just be too unfair. And that can't possibly be true. So therefore, God has to exist. Okay, so you see it there stated very briefly. It says that if God did not exist, then in that case, the world would just be way too unfair. And so since that's not possible, there must be a God. Let me try and explain the basis of this claim here. Okay, so maybe it's a little bit of a disturbing thought, but let's go there. Do bad things ever happen to good people, you guys think? Do people that are good people, who have done nothing wrong, do they ever suffer some of the worst losses or harms? And is that something that has ever happened or does happen? Simple question. Bad things happening to good people? Yes, and that's a sad thing, and we wish that wouldn't happen. But unfortunately, that's reality. That does happen. You know, examples of like school shootings where horrifying events. Little children have been murdered. People have been raped. People have been tortured. People have been persecuted, put behind bars for no reason. Right? Shot in the street. All kinds of horrifying things happen and have happened and are happening around the world all the time. Most of the time, we hope we don't have anything to do with that, but unfortunately, that's part of life. So look, bad things can happen to good people. Now, what is something that could somehow make that less unfair? You know, if a good person suffered grievously in life, well, if there was a God, right, God could restore fairness here. Because what could God do for this person, say, if they went to their grave having suffered, or gone through the worst experiences, but they were good people morally? What could happen if God existed to make this situation more fair? Let me ask you that. What do you think? So if a bad thing happens to a good person, well, yeah, you're saying, Jasmine, God also suffered. Not what I'm talking about, though. If you're referring to Christianity, in the Christian tradition, they say Jesus Christ, the Son of God, was crucified. But not everyone believes in that one religion. Nonetheless, that's what I was thinking. Yeah, guys, Isaac and Alicia, send them to heaven. So if a person suffered all throughout their life, or maybe not all throughout their life, but just something really unjust happened to them, like they were murdered or something, but they did nothing wrong, if God exists, he could balance the scales of justice, right? It was not just, it was not fair they were treated like that during their life. But if there's a God, then in the afterlife, he'll be able to put them in heaven, and that'll kind of reward them for their good life, you know? But if there's no God, you could say, well, this good person suffered, and there was no compensation for that. They just died, and that was the end. On the other hand, let me ask another type of question. Do good things ever happen to bad people? Or, you know, like, are there ever people that are evil, wicked, that end up enjoying the best things of life and never, ever being punished or held accountable? Can good things happen to bad people? And the answer there is also yes. Now, I'm not trying to make you guys cynical or pessimistic, like good people always suffer and bad people always prosper. I'm not saying that at all, but it can happen, and it has happened, right? There have been people that have done the worst things you can imagine that never got held accountable, and maybe they even went to their grave feeling self-satisfied, you know? Like, take the example of a serial killer like the Zodiac killer that nobody ever caught. This person really loved killing other people. It's disgusting to say that, but if that person really found that enjoyable, then you might say, well, if they never got held accountable in life, then they passed on and they felt like they got what they wanted out of life. But that seems so wrong, doesn't it? That someone can just do all these terrible things and never ever suffer and never ever be held accountable. So here's another question. You could say, okay, it's a good example, Sarah. Yeah, so like here, take the case like what you're mentioning. If there's a God, though, he could right the wrongs, and he could rectify the injustice. In this case, by doing what? The person felt happy when they passed away, even though they led a horrible life on the moral side of things. So if there's a God, he could balance the scales of justice by doing what for this person or to this person? You already got the other side of the equation when you said send the good person to heaven, even if they suffered in life. Well, here's the converse of that. bad person that got everything they wanted out of life. If there's a God, he could punish this person, maybe send them to hell, purgatory, whatever. Right, correct. So here's the idea. God would be this divine dispenser of justice. He could reward people for the good lives they lived, and he could punish people for the lives that they lived that were bad. But if there was no God, okay, and that's what this is saying, suppose it's just a discussion, but suppose there was no God. If there wasn't, then these bad people would go to their graves and never suffer a punishment. And the good people that suffered in life would go to their graves and would never be rewarded. And that would be the end of it. So the argument is saying that that is just too unfair. If that was the case, then this is a hopelessly unfair universe. So that can't be true. Therefore, there must be a God. Okay? Now, Derek, I mean, you're asking a good question, and actually we're going to touch on that in just a moment. So I want you to hold your thought. This is definitely on point. You say, if there was a God, why would they allow the unbalance in the first place? Well, I don't want to anticipate the conversation that we're about to have too much, because we're going to go right into that. But there are ways that people try to get around that dilemma. Some might say that the appearance of harm, evil, etc., pain and suffering in life is just an illusion, or God wants us to be able to persevere, and so allowing us to see the negative side gives us a greater sense of striving towards the good. You know, there are creative ways to try and justify the existence of at least the appearance of evil within reality, to give us something to overcome, to give us a choice to make. These are the kind of things that I think would be said to reply to that. But I'm not saying those are great replies. We'll find criticism of that in a minute. A good question. Okay, so anyway, just mentioning here, one more argument for God's existence. There has to be a God, because without there being such a thing as God, bad people, good things could happen to them with no punishment, and good people, bad things could happen to them with no reward. Well, what is the basic problem with this argument? Because remember, Nagel's an atheist, so he doesn't find this to be a compelling argument. Do you, just hearing it, think you can point out what might be problematic about the argument, or is there something about it that's not fully convincing to you? If so, just throw it out, and maybe what you'll say will be relative to or related to what the author Nagel says. Why do you think it's not the most effective argument? Like, what could be said back against this in terms of saying it doesn't really prove that God exists? Let me see if anyone has any reaction to that. Does this prove God exists? If not, why not? Because now I'm trying to get to the criticisms of it. Okay, so you're saying here, sorry, 1 second. I always forget the actual name that you have there. And so I'm like scrolling way up in the comments to find it. Oh, it's Nicholas. Thanks, Nick. Okay, so you've said level of unfairness is different for everyone. No, that's not the issue. Where's the proof of heaven and hell? Alicia, that's a little bit closer. Yeah, I guess one way of looking at it is that. And then David, I think you're hitting on the really essential criticism here. There you go. Why is it assumed in the argument that the universe is fair? That's the sort of premise that lies behind this argument. The universe has to be fair. If there wasn't a God, it wouldn't be, so there must be a God. But a critic can say, stop right there, though. You started the argument by saying this universe must be a fair place. And who says that that's something that is necessarily obvious? I mean, actually, to the contrary. Probably you guys have had it drilled into your head by your parents and others since you're a little child that, hey, life isn't fair. I find that to be such a cynical and just dark comment to make, like life isn't fair. What are you telling a little kid when you say that? Like, just get used to it. Nothing's ever going to be fair, so just accept it. I mean, shouldn't we want it to be fair, though, at the minimum? Anyway, putting that aside, I'm just mentioning that common saying, that cliche saying, because it seems like that's the truism that everyone holds to be the fact, that life is not fair. Just understand that. If you expect it to be fair, you're bound to be disappointed over and over again. So the argument here says, no, to the contrary, it actually is fair, at least because God in the end can, right the wrongs and dispense justice in the afterlife. But unless we assumed the premise that the universe and the world is fair, the argument would not necessarily have any kind of appeal. And that's what Ernest Nagel really does say. He says, the argument sounds like a person saying that if God existed, then the world would be fair. But, and certainly we would like it for the world to be fair, but it sounds more like the projection of human hopes than something that we can establish by evidence. Like, yeah, it would be nice if we could have a guarantee that good people receive a reward and bad people do not. But this is mere projection and postulation of hope, and it's not based on evidence. So just because the world would be more fair if God in fact exists, we have no guarantee that it actually is, and therefore he sees this as just kind of a weak argument. Let me read his words. Yeah, so he said, he says here, so he borrows this argument from Immanuel Kant. That's an author we'll talk about in a few weeks. But it says here, Kant was aware that although virtue may be its own reward, the virtuous man does not always receive his just deserts in this world. Nor did he shut his eyes to the fact that evil men frequently enjoy the best things that the world has to offer. In short, virtue does not always reap happiness, and vice does not always reap unhappiness. Nevertheless, the highest human good is the realization of happiness comparable with your virtue. But what can guarantee that this is realizable? Such a guarantee can only be found in God, who must therefore exist if this is not to be a mere ideal. The existence of an omnipotent, omniscient, and omnibenevolent God is thus postulated as a necessary requirement for the possibility of morality and a moral life. And then he criticizes it. So he says, despite the prestige the argument has acquired, it's difficult to grant it any force. It's easy enough to assume God's existence, but assuming it has all the advantages of theft over honest work. No assumption carries with it any assurance that what we assume is actually true. And though we may assume God's existence as a way of guaranteeing the possibility of realizing happiness together with virtue, the postulation, the assumption, establishes neither the actual realizability of the ideal nor the fact of his existence. Okay, so there you go. It's just it's an assumption not based on evidence. It seems more like an optimistic affirmation of what we would hope in case the universe is a just place in the end. Okay, so one more miscellaneous argument for God's existence that he also wants to call out for criticism is it's sometimes called the argument from religious experience, or even the argument from mystical experience. But I prefer the first label because mysticism may carry with it connotations of like Eastern religious practice or whatever, which is not necessarily being mentioned. So let's call it the argument from religious experience. Okay, so based on the name, maybe you can infer what the overall basic idea of this argument is. So somebody may actually believe in God based on having a religious experience. And so when you ask the person, do you believe in God? And they say yes. And then if you follow it up by asking, why do you believe in God? What's the reason or argument that led you to believe in God? If the person believes based on this kind of argument, then what would they say to you? What do you think it is when a person believes in God based on religious experience? What do you think that means? Let me hear from you. What do you think is a religious experience? Just any comment, any reaction to that? Let me see what you think. What's a religious experience? How could a person refer or cite that and say that's what I'm basing my belief in God on? Let's see what you can say. Okay, Alicia, you're saying praying. Praying is something that's religious, but by itself, without a little more detail added, I don't think it would by itself qualify as a religious experience per se. Ismail, also not necessarily the right idea. So like if you're just saying an experience like I went to church, no, or I got baptized, no, it's deeper than that. It's like what you're saying, Derek or Litzy. It's when an event happened and the person thinks this revealed God to me. Like I had this moment in this experience in my life where the fact that God exists was somehow made present to me, was manifest to me. Like maybe it could have happened during a near-death experience, right, Sarah? And a person said after that, I could see the being of God, or I could feel his presence, and I got snatched back from that I was on the operating table and I woke up. Or sometimes it could happen. Alicia, yeah, that's a good example. So you're thinking, take a case where someone prayed and then the event was fulfilled. Maybe you could say that was auspicious. I could feel the reality of God because of the fulfillment of my prayer. Diego, I like the way you put it very generally, right? Like some event where they felt that there was an external thing such as God. And that really is indefinite in variety. I mean, it could be like a person is praying, meditating, and they felt like some kind of communion with the universe and God revealed himself to that person at that moment. It could be just a transcendent, like you had a child and all of a sudden like God's existence dawned on you and it became abundantly obvious to you that you're being made aware of the reality, the presence of God. So powerful religious experiences, I can't like overly define them because they're not just one specific kind of event, but it could be, you know, the intense episode of meditation or prayer. It could be the fulfillment of a divinely requested act. It could be surviving a near-death experience and having a close brush with death that made you aware or feel that you're aware of the presence of God. So anyway, sometimes people have what they qualify or claim to be religious experiences of these various kinds. And then they would use that as their basis. So you ask the person, why do you believe in God? And they will say, I'll tell you why. Because this thing happened to me and I had this experience. And when that happened, it was like God was just showing himself to me and I could tell that he exists, right? That's also a good example, Jasmine. Just so we all know, though, like these are all in the ballpark and none of them are like the only correct answer, right? So a religious experience can take a variety of forms is all I'm saying. But what they kind of have in common is afterwards, the person says, right there, I could tell God existed, okay? Now, so that's the argument. And uses this as evidence that God exists. Okay, now that's the argument, and I don't want you to overthink it too much. It's just somebody had a powerful experience. They thought it was like transcendent, mystical, enlightening, and whatever the case is, that showed them that there's a God, or they say that it did. But we are talking about Ernest Nagel, right? And he doesn't agree with any of these arguments. So what do you think is the criticism that could be given against the argument from religious experience? Take the point of view of the opponent here. What do you think someone could say, hey, that doesn't really prove there's God? Like, what could be the rebuttal of this form of argument? Someone says, I had a powerful experience. Let me describe it to you. There you go. God exists. Now, what does a critic say back in terms of trying to dispute that that's a proof of God? What, even in theory, can one say to show that that's, in their mind, not proof? Okay, well, one thing you said, Jasmine, is that they haven't experienced it themselves. Yeah. If the other person's not a believer, then clearly they haven't had a similar type of experience. But why is it that the other one having the experience isn't proof? You know what I mean? Like, why is it that their claim of a religious experience doesn't really prove that there was an actual God? Because what you said, and it's a good comment, but what you're saying is, well, the critic, the skeptic, hasn't had the experience. Okay, so Nicholas, you're saying maybe the person just got lucky. Are you only thinking, though, of the one case of like surviving near death? This is why I said don't overemphasize just one possible variety of religious experience. What about the dude that's just on the top of a mountain meditating and he feels like he saw God? That's not, I mean, what do you mean by luck in that case? Maria, hallucinations often happen in accidents. Jasmine, you're saying no evidence. Okay, good. We're all kind of getting to the right idea here. What he says is something that probably you've been thinking or you can understand pretty easily. That the one who makes the claim of the religious experience, well, who has access to their evidence? Who can see the evidence of their religious experience? Can the other person just inspect it and verify it? Like, let me see it, and then I'll be able to tell. No, right? And so I guess maybe that's what you mean by no evidence, Jasmine. The evidence, if there is any, is private to the one who had the experience because it's locked away in their own memories and in their own psychology. So it's not like you can offer up your evidence to another person, right? If I said Jones is the murderer, and you say why, I say, well, here's some evidence. Look, a footprint of his was found on the crime scene, and I could just show you the footprint, and you can evaluate it, inspect it, and come to the same conclusion as me. But if I say I had a powerful religious experience, I almost died, and I saw God at that moment, so that's how I know he's real. The other person can't say, well, I've seen your same religious experience, and therefore I can validate it. So that's one issue. You can't make the evidence public. It's private. It's something that's only for you. That's how experiences are. Like, I could tell you about when I went to Coachella, but it's not you having the same experience. Even if we've both been there, like say you ever went to that festival, we would have had our separate experiences of the same event, even if we went to the same one. So experiences being private can't be made available for the review of others. So one thing is that it's not the most effective argument to convince a skeptic. And that's the only kind of person you would ever need to convince, because a fellow believer doesn't need to be convinced. They're already on your same side and they agree with you. So if you walk up to another theist and you say, yeah, I believe in God because I had a religious experience, they'll probably just come back and be like, yeah, so did I. High five. It's awesome. God exists. But you make arguments with people who don't agree with you, right? So you're trying to persuade a non-believer if you make the case for this argument. And a non-believer, being a non-believer, is not going to have any such experience themselves. Okay, so that's one issue, that the evidence cannot be shared. But another issue is this, and I think it's something that some of you have mentioned, Maria and some others have said above. Is there any other way to explain the presence of the claimed experience without the supernatural or without the divine? Like, could it be that a person thought they had a religious experience, but it was something just psychological? Possibly, yes. So there's always going to be some kind of naturalistic, meaning not supernatural, alternative explanation for the same claim. You could say, well, the person thought they were in the presence of God, but they were sleep deprived, or they were hallucinating because they were in a heightened state of anxiety or panic, or maybe they were on drugs, or maybe they were losing their mind and going through a psychotic episode. So I'm not saying that that's what really the case is, but to a skeptic, the skeptic might very well think that although the person is claiming to have had such an experience, there's an actual explanation that has nothing to do with God or religion. So because there's a way of explaining the claimed experience on a natural basis, and also because the experience can't be put forward to another person, it therefore fails, according to Nagel, as persuasive argument for a skeptic. And let me read about it from him. Here's what he said on that. He says, one further type of argument, pervasive in Protestant theology, deserves mention. Arguments of this type take their point of departure from the psychology of religious experience. Those who have undergone such experiences often report that during the experience they feel themselves to be in the presence of the holy and the divine, that they lose their sense of self-identity, become merged with some fundamental reality, or enjoy a feeling of total dependence upon an ultimate power. The overwhelming sense of transcending your finite self, which characterizes these vivid experiences, is then taken to be evidence for the existence of the Supreme Being. So he says below, it would be flying in the face of well-attested facts to deny that such experiences do occur. So he concedes experiences happen, but he says then, but do these facts constitute evidence for the conclusion that they are derived from? Does the fact, for example, that an individual experiences a profound sense of contact with an alleged transcendent ground of reality, does that fact constitute evidence for the claim that there is such a being? And he says, well, no. No one will dispute that sometimes people have experiences where they see ghosts or pink elephants, but only if you have no skepticism, only if you're very gullible and not skeptical at all, would you, without further consideration, count those as establishing or proving that these things exist. To establish the existence of those things, we would need evidence that could be obtained under controlled conditions and that could be confirmed by independent thinkers. Again, though, a man's report that he is suffering pain may be taken at face value, but we cannot take at face value the claim that it is the food that he ate which caused the pain. So it's like a person may have had an experience, but they may not know the cause of the experience. They may think that they had a vivid religious experience, but they may not know that they were actually going through like an episode mentally or whatever in the brain. So that is his kind of formal response to that further argument for God's existence. It's based on evidence that can't be shared, and there's a way of explaining the appearance of the experience that doesn't necessarily involve certainty that God exists. Okay, so there's just one last thing, though, from Nagel. Okay, and then we're going to move on to the next author in the series. So we've, so far in the class, just looked at arguments that God does exist, paired with objections to those same arguments. But we have not yet looked at any person making an argument for the opposite claim, that God doesn't exist, right? We've not looked at any atheists trying to prove there's no God. But there are some arguments like that, and I at least want to mention one, and that's something Nagel talks about, so I'm going to bring it out from his paper right now. This is a classical skeptical argument against the existence of God. It goes back really thousands of years. It's been, I think, a thorn in the side of the church for a long time. In fact, it was considered so important to rebut these type of arguments that there was a whole genre of writing in the medieval period of the Christian church where reasons were marshaled and given to try and dispute this. But this is an argument favored by atheists to show there's no God, and it's called the problem of evil. Okay, the problem of evil. So in logic and in philosophy, a lot of times when we write an argument, we write it in what's called standard form, meaning that the conclusion of the argument goes at the bottom, below a horizontal line, and then what are called the premises of the argument are listed above. The conclusion of the argument is the claim that you're trying to prove to be true. And the premises of the argument listed above are the reasons that are given, the evidence that is given that's supposed to back up and support the conclusion. So here I'm going to write out the problem of evil argument. It's got two premises, so I'll just list those here, and then the conclusion below. So the first premise just says that if God did exist, then in that case there would be no evil in the world. Okay, first premise, first evidence claim of the argument says if God existed, then there would be no evil in the world. And then the second premise says, but there is evil in the world. So the conclusion of the argument, do you think you could deduce what the argument conclusion is? It's not that you're saying this, but the argument that's being presented, what is its conclusion? It's something you should be able to, I think, deduce, because it just says that if God existed, there wouldn't be evil. But actually there is evil. So the conclusion would be that what? Yes, Jasmine, no, we'll talk about that. We're going to definitely get to that point, but I want to make sure we get the argument out there first. So since there's evil in the world, God doesn't exist. That would be the conclusion. God does not exist. Now, I first want to help you guys just break the argument down and understand the details. Let's consider the first premise. It says that if God existed, there would be no evil in the world. So here's a question. Why do you think that is a claim that someone would make? What is it about God that, at least according to some people's mind, would rule out the existence of evil? Why is it that some argue God would be incompatible with allowing there to be evil? What is it about God that is so contradictory to the existence of evil in the world? According to, put yourself in the mind of Nagel and those that follow the argument. Why would one say this? Why would one say that in case there was God, there could not be evil? Okay, yes, because God is said to be pure good. That's one of the points. Correct. But not just his perfect goodness. That's correct, but it's only half. He's perfectly good, so that would mean that he would not like evil and he would like goodness. And he would want to counteract the evil that does happen if it did. But beyond just being all good, of course, he's also called or defined as what? Common definition or understanding of God is that he's both all good, but crucially, he is also all-powerful. That's right, Tina. All good and all-powerful. So think of those two features together. A being that is all good would, okay, let me say it this way. A being that's all good would not want there to be evil. And a being that's all powerful would have unlimited power to stop the evil if he wanted to, right? So if you have unlimited power, then evil only exists if you let it. And if you're perfectly good, you wouldn't want to let it because evil is contrary to good. So having perfect goodness and perfect power, you would think he would not allow for there to be any evil in the world. That would just run contrary to being perfectly powerful and good. But nonetheless, there is evil in the world. Okay, so the second premise is pretty simple to understand. But again, we can mention some of the things we just talked about. Is there evil in the world? Well, I mean, yeah, little children starve. I mean, people get abused. People get, I mean, it's the worst things you can imagine, right? We could just go down the list. The Holocaust. I mean, there's all kinds of terrible things. War, famine, diseases that are taking people out. I mean, even in our country, we've lost like 400,000 people over the last year. It's a tragedy, right? So there's a lot of bad things anyway. That's all this is saying. So the claim is then there must not be God, because if there was, he wouldn't let all these things happen, and he would be able to stop them. So there just must not be any God that's perfectly powerful and good, because we see that there's evil. How could there be evil if there was this kind of being? So that's the conclusion of the argument. Now, Jasmine, let me come back up to what you said here, because I want to always have balance, right? When we presented the arguments that God exists, we showed criticisms that some skeptics would give. Now we have an argument from an atheist trying to show there's no God. And this argument could be criticized too from the other side. So what do you think could be a way of trying to deny this argument's conclusion? Anything that can be said? Well, Jasmine, I think I see above what you commented is really a good point on this. You could say, no, this is a bad argument, because if God existed, it's not like there would be no evil in the world. He would let there be some evil because that gives us a sense of the contrast between good and evil. And it allows us to strive for good and even be tempted by evil, but that gives us a choice, doesn't it? So you could argue then that this is a false premise. God allows for what we call evil. A common objection to this that even Nagel mentions is that some say, well, it's not, premise 2 is false. You think of it as there's evil in the world, but it's all for the best. If you could see it from God's point of view, like a God's eye view, as it were, you'd see that what we think of as evil is actually all for the best in the biggest possible picture, because again, it holds the goodness that we experience as a contrast, and it gives us a greater reason to value it. Diego, and you're saying, not one person or individual is able to rid the world of all evil, as there will always be those who rebel against the common mindset. But Diego, come on. We're talking about God. God could do whatever he wants, right? If God exists, nothing you could do to stop him from stopping you being evil. You know what I mean? Like, so you're saying, oh, there will always be people who rebel against the common mindset. Well, if God wanted to, he could make those people change their mind, couldn't he? You understand? So I don't know. How is it that you're putting it on people if God controls everything? You know what I mean? Like, I'm playing devil's advocate, I guess, to help you think about why one might push back against that point. But yeah, the criticism against this that I was just mentioning is that evil is really just an illusion formed from our limited perspective. And looking at it all from the biggest picture, you'd see that it's all for the best, that God would never do anything wrong. But here's what Nagel says back against that point. He says, even if it's just apparent evil, suppose it's just an illusion, like it looks like evil, but from the point of view of God, it's all for the best. Nagel says, isn't even just like apparent evil not as good as things could possibly be? Say that you like poke your head into like a torture chamber somewhere where someone's being persecuted for no reason at all, right? Which we know happens in some parts of the world. And you say, hey, I know it seems bad in there, but trust me, God's got your back and everything's for the best. This is not really a bad thing. God knows what he's doing. It probably would come as cold comfort to that person. It would be no consolation to say, oh, it's just the illusion of evil that I'm going through. Even the illusion is less ideal than having no such illusion of evil. Here's another thing that some say, and I know many of you maybe were thinking of this. Well, what's the evil from, though? It's from people doing bad stuff. Although, to be fair, there's all kinds of natural disasters, earthquakes, hurricanes, and stuff, volcanoes popping off that kill people that have nothing to do with the human choice. But setting that aside, you could say, well, when people murder or kill or rape or torture, whatever, that's a choice they make, and God gave them free will. But this takes us back into very deep and puzzling questions about, like, Isn't the existence of free will, though, kind of inconsistent with God's knowledge of everything? I mean, if God knows everything you're going to do, then how could you really do otherwise? And furthermore, I've always had this thought in mind. They say that the possibility to act and do evil is licensed by free will. And so the only way that we could avoid having the tendency to commit evil is if we didn't have the freedom to do it. But I always feel like that's kind of cynical, right? Like, just having the option to do something evil doesn't mean that people actually have to do it. So I feel like people could still have free will even if they just thought of the concept of doing something evil and they just didn't want to. You know, you could still imagine a world where there are movies where people are killed and harmed, but everyone watching the movie is like, man, I'm glad nothing like that has ever really happened. Even though we could do it, we're not going to do it. So I'm not 100% convinced on my own account that there needs to really be evil for people to be described as free in their choices, you know? But anyway, that's a little bit of a far field from what we're doing here, I guess. In the end, that's just one more argument. It purports to establish the non-existence of God. I've tried to show you what the objections and the pushback might be. And I've also mentioned just briefly now how Nagel himself tries to take on those rebuttals. Okay, so we're moving on from Nagel then. I'm going to the next. All right, so let's see. Next in our list here, after Mr. Nagel, it's Pascal's wager. Okay, so this is one more argument for God's existence, or for the belief in God. It's not too hard to understand, I think, but it's quite interesting. Okay, so here's who wrote this one. Just flip my notes. New author. Okay, so this is a French philosopher of the 17th century. His name is Blaise Pascal. Okay, and his lifespan, I believe, is 1623, to 1662. 1623 to 1662. So, I mean, he had a kind of short life, I guess, less than 40 years. But he was a distinguished academic and a brilliant mind. He was a mathematician, physicist, and he was a philosopher of religion. So, learned fellow, well knowledgeable in a variety of different disciplines in the academy. He wrote a book, and the book was actually published after his life, posthumously, in 1669. This book of 1669, published after his death, is called Pensées, which is a French word that just means, in English, thoughts. Okay? Thoughts. So the French philosopher and scientist and mathematician Blaise Pascal from the 17th century writes this book, Pensées, aka Thoughts. And within it, we learn about this argument now that we're all going to study, which is called the wager. Okay, the wager. So the wager from Pensées, there's the dates and the author. Today, in the centuries since he wrote that, we often refer to this argument as Pascal's wager. But Pascal is the original author, so he's not egotistical enough to call it Pascal's wager. He just calls it the wager, and generations after him have given it his namesake. Okay, so the wager, or if you like, Pascal's wager. Now let's learn about it. Okay, so the first thing you would notice in looking at his argument is that he takes a much all those other authors, if you have followed along, were trying to show that God exists. They thought they could prove that God is real, that he exists. In the ontological, he must exist because of the definition. In the cosmological, he must exist because the universe exists and there has to be something that started it. In the design argument, he must exist because there's a lot of complexity in the works of nature, and those things can't happen without a designer, just like a watch. Well, here's another way of getting to that same result, but it's a different approach. Pascal says right away in the very beginning, no one can prove whether God exists. He says that straight out. So he says, nobody could prove it, nobody could disprove it. And the reason is because if God exists, he is so far beyond our powers of comprehension, because he would be an infinite being with no limitations, no limits. So for us, limited, finite human minds, that would far surpass our abilities to reason about or to logically prove. So he says, let's not even try that game of proving that God exists. It's not possible. It actually, he says, would be foolish to even try because it would go beyond our powers of judgment and analysis as human beings. So he says clearly and definitively, I can't prove the existence of God. You can't prove it. Nobody could prove it. Also, nobody could disprove it. So he says that can't be done. And it's interesting because he also then says this, that sometimes people like religious folks, Christians, as he's a Christian himself, sometimes he says they'll be criticized if they say, I don't have an argument for God's existence. I don't know if I can prove it. And he says, in a way, it's not fair to criticize someone for saying that because it actually makes sense to not have an argument for God's existence because as he thinks, it's almost like egotistical and foolish to think that you could even attempt to do such a thing. In his mind, it's almost more respectful of God to not even attempt such a proof. So he says that. He says, we can't make this proof. But here's one thing he says we do know. So he says we don't know specifically whether God exists or not because we can't prove it either way. But we know for a fact that either God exists or what? You think you can finish my thought there? He says we don't know which one it is, whether it's that he exists or that he does not. But we know that it has to be either what or what. What do you think is this either or statement that I'm hinting at? It says which case it is specifically will forever be impossible to prove. But definitively, it has to be that it's either what or what. We don't know if he exists or not, but we know that he either what or what. Just let me know. What do you think? What do you think is the certain thing that even if we don't know specifically whether he exists or not exists, we know that it's got to be one or the other? That's right. Thanks, David. Yes. Jasmine, you follow me? It's that he either exists or doesn't exist. We don't know which one it is, and we can't prove it either way, but it has to be one or the other. Okay? It's sort of like this. Let me give you a totally, it's a similar type of example, but with a different case. Aliens out there in outer space, do they exist? I don't know. I can't prove that they do. I can't prove that they don't. But here's a fact. They either exist or they don't exist. Because there's only two possible cases, and that covers both. It's either that there is such a thing, and if there's any aliens out there in outer space, then that's the case. And if there are none, then that's the case. But it can't be that they both exist and don't. So it's exactly one or the other. And that's what he says to start. He says, no one can make a proof of which one, but we know it's got to be one or the other. So that much is true. Okay, so here are just a few points to mention as we're describing this. None can prove whether God exists or not. But we know for a fact that God either exists or does not exist. This sentence here, which says God either exists or doesn't, is an example of what's called a disjunction. Disjunction is just a word in grammar and logic which refers to an either-or sentence. So if I say to you like that after class I'm either going to watch TV or go for a run, that would be a disjunction. And in every disjunction, there's two terms. There's the first disjunct and the second disjunct. The first disjunct is the thing that you say in the first part of the sentence, and the second disjunct is the one that you say after the word or. So if I say to you like that I'm either going to get pizza or tacos for dinner tonight, then the first disjunct of that disjunction is I'm getting pizza, and the second disjunct is I'm getting tacos. So here's this disjunction. Either God exists or does not exist. And we know that it must be one of those two cases, but we can't prove which one. Okay? So he says this. It's kind of like then you just have to choose which position to take without having proof. So instead of the question of what's the proof or disproof, let's ask you what you have to either gain or lose if you take either of these two positions. The next thing he does is that he kind of creates an analogy between the choice whether to believe in God or not and wagering on a coin flip. Okay, so take a coin flip bet. If you flip a coin and you wait for it to land, it's going to land one of two ways, right? It's going to either land heads or it's going to land tails. And this is parallel to the scenario he's giving here, because when you flip the coin, you don't know which side it's going to land. You can't know in advance. That's why the flip and the outcome is a 50-50 random thing. But you know that it's going to be one or the other, right? So it's sort of like this. With God, one side of the coin is that he could exist. The other side of the coin is that maybe he doesn't exist. We don't know which one it is, but we know that it's got to be exactly one of those two cases and not both. So he says you then are being called on to basically make a wager. He compares it to a bet, okay? With a coin flip, the bet is either choose heads or choose tails. And with that coin flip bet, you can either win by choosing the right face or lose by choosing the face that didn't show up, okay? So let me show you, for example, the way that a coin flip wager works. Okay, so this is a little Punnett square, as they sometimes call it. In game theory, we sometimes evaluate a choice decision by showing the options available to you and then the outcomes that could happen. So up here, I'm going to show the two possible outcomes of a coin flip. And they're going to be the header of these two vertical columns. So one is that the coin can land heads. Okay, now for this vertical column, we show the other possible outcome of the coin flip. Hi, Nagel. What's the other outcome, obviously? Landing heads is one, and you guys know the alternative, but just checking with you to make sure that we're all on the same page. With a coin flip, what's the other alternative outcome? Instead of landing heads, obviously, it is that it could, what again? Landing tails, exactly. Okay, lands tails over here. Now, over here in the left horizontal rows, we're going to place the two betting choices that you can make if you're going to enter into this coin flip wager. So if you're betting on a coin flip, what's one of the picks that you can pick? You can choose, let me know. Choose what or choose what? That's what the two things you're going to say here. So let me know what you think I'm going to write or what I should write in the horizontal column or rows rather here. Okay, you can choose heads or you can choose tails. Good. Choose heads, choose tails. Okay, now looking at this box, this grid here has 4 boxes inset within it. And each one of them connects a particular betting decision with an outcome of the coin flip. Okay, so like for example, this box stands for you chose heads and heads landed. So I want us to fill in these 4 boxes the letters W or L to stand for whether that would have been a win or a loss. Okay, so let's just go box by box, starting here. When a person chooses heads and heads is what landed, is this a win or is that a loss? Let me know. Top left box. W, good. That's winning. That's choosing heads. It comes down, boom, it's heads. Yes, I won. Okay? So we're going to continue. Top right box. Person chooses heads, and tails is what the face that showed up. Okay, good. We got the top left one. I see you guys with the win, but now for this one. Choosing heads, landing tails, that's what? Is it a win or a loss? It's a loss. Good, this is a loss here. That's choosing heads, but it didn't turn out to be heads that showed out. It was tails that showed. Okay, now, bottom left. One chooses tails, and heads was the face that landed. Maybe preface your comments so I know which one you're referring to. Box 3 here. Call that box 3. What is this, W or L? Okay, I think I'm seeing the answer here, right? It's another L. Yeah. Another loss because a person is choosing tails and it didn't turn out to be tails. And finally, one more case. A person chooses tails, and that's what showed out. So box 4, what do you think? Box 3, lost, good. Box 4, W. Okay, correct. So anyway, look. With a neutral coin that has a 50-50 chance of it being heads or tails, there's 2 ways to win and 2 ways to lose. You can win by choosing heads when heads lands. You can also win by choosing tails when tails lands, and vice versa. You can lose when you have a mismatch, when your choice was heads and tails was the outcome, or if your choice was tails and heads was the outcome. Now, this is parallel, he says, to our choice whether to believe in God or not. And let me explain to you what the parallel is. In the same way as a coin has 2 sides and it has to be one or the other, but you don't know which one until you flip it, with God existing or not existing, it has to be one of those two. It can't be both. It has to be exactly that he either does exist and it's real, or he doesn't exist and it's all just a story. So it's one or the other, and you don't know which one. But he says, since you can't prove it, you basically have to take a bet. And when you make a bet, you basically consider what the stakes are and what the possible wins and losses could be. Nobody wants to take a more dangerous bet if there's a safer bet that they could take, right? And a safer bet is one that exposes you to less risk and has a greater potential upside in terms of winning. A more dangerous bet is one that holds less possibility of win and has a lot of risk if you take that bet. Okay, so we're going to now change the little box and show why he thinks that believing in God, even if you can't prove it, is just a much better, safer bet. Okay, so here's a new little Punnett square thing, and we again create this inset of 4. Now, in this case, the wager's not on heads or tails. It's on whether you're going to believe or not believe. So let's put the 2 choices in the horizontal rows first. What's one choice you could make with respect to the question God exists or does not exist? You yourself could choose to take what position? One of those 2. Let's just get the first one on the top row. A person can make the bet, the wager, if you like to insist on the metaphor, of choosing to believe that God exists. Okay, believe God exists. And of course, the other option. Oh yeah, River. I know you're already on top of it, and you're ahead of the game. But just let's get there a little slower, because I think you're on the right track. What you're saying is correct. But let me put this here. What's the other choice, guys? Just so we know. You can choose to believe. We got that. In this other row, though, it's the other choice, and that would be to what? Just to think about the other row. One top row, believing God, versus the other choice, not believing. Okay. Okay, now up here. Now we're going to have the 2 outcomes. So like in the other case, it was heads or tails could be the outcome. But now we're talking about whether this belief is true or false. So one way that things could play out in the end is that it could turn out that actually what? What's one of the possible results of this wager? It could turn out to be actually the case that what? Just telling me what to put on the header of this left column. Yeah, so it could be that, well, you say the afterlife exists. I was just going to say that God exists, but we will talk about the afterlife. So one case is that God exists, and that could be true. Again, remember, he says no one will know whether it's true or not, but that's possible. Maybe it's like a coin flip, a 50-50. The other possibility, of course, is the contrary, so that God does not exist. So he says, you're basically now in a position where you got to take a chance on one of these 2 wagers. And he says you have to commit yourself to either believing or not believing. Here's an important point, because he says it's a forced wager, meaning that it's one wager that you can't avoid. In a real life wager of a coin flip, right? Suppose some random person walked up to you and said, hey, let's bet. I got a coin. Tell me what you want to pick, heads or tails, and we'll bet for the coin. If you don't like betting and you don't like that kind of thing, then what can you say to this individual? Sorry, buddy, but I'm not going to take either chance because I don't want to bet on your coin, and I'm just going to avoid the whole wager. In this case, though, Pascal says you can't avoid this wager, though, because say that you approach it like, I'm not going to take any position. Whether God exists or not, I'm not going to choose, so I'm not going to bet. With this wager, though, he says you're already committed then, because a choice not to believe is equivalent to taking no position. So if you don't want to make any wager, then that's still equivalent to wagering that God doesn't exist. So basically, we're all locked in, and we have to make one choice one way or the other. So the last thing then is just to consider what the possible risks and rewards could be for either of the two bets. And that's when we're now going to fill in these boxes, okay? So let's take this first top left, box 1, we'll call it. Say somebody believed in God, and it turned out that actually, yes, he did exist. So in our sort of crude way of putting it, is this a win or a loss for the bettor, for the one who bets? To believe that God exists, and then he did. Would this be the win or the loss? For our box 1. Yeah, it is a win. And okay, now we can get into the discussion of afterlife and stuff. So what would be the winning though? What is one? What's the jackpot, if you will? If you believed in God and yes, he did exist, that means you were correct, but what would you win? What's the winning? It's not a 25-cent piece. It's something much greater according to, scripture and theology. What's the thing that is won, if anything? It's heaven. That's right. It's heaven. And how good is heaven? Heaven is supposed to be, it's described as the greatest thing possible. It's like infinitely happy life. Life in abundance of happiness and paradise for all time, for eternity. So, that would be a win bigger than any other win you could possibly fathom. So it's like positive to infinity. Okay, so it's a great win. Suppose that you believed in God, and another scenario, there actually was no God. So that would not be a win. But what's lost? What is the loss, if anything, when a person believes in God and it wasn't really true? Just speaking hypothetically, okay? So like suppose someone believed in God and hypothetically speaking, let's say there wasn't a God, then I guess they weren't correct. It would be like choosing a coin face that didn't turn out. But what's the loss, if anything, here? Okay, Ishmael, you say nothing, and I kind of know what you mean because it's like, well, I'm not punished, and it's not like I really suffered through anything. But if there's a loss at all, and good, Derek, another good, very insightful comment, and we will talk about that too. Some people would argue that belief, merely on the basis that you're trying to insure against losing out on heaven, might not win the reward of God, and that's something that some critics of this argument do say. But we'll get to that, okay? So anyway, though, if you believe in God and he doesn't exist, you lose, I don't know. If anything, it's not much. It might be just some time and energy that it took to practice the religion. And even then, some people might say that's not even a loss because I enjoyed all the time and energy that I devoted towards reading scripture, going to church, finding a religious community. But to some, they might say, well, if there was no God, then it was kind of a wasted effort and you did all those things and there was no ultimate reward. So if anything, maybe you get a little of lost time. But that's not so bad. But we still have two more things to fill in. So here's another case. Say that someone didn't believe in God, but oops, they were wrong and there actually is God. Now, is that a win or a loss? Well, if you follow the pattern that we've been given, that's a loss. But what would be the loss of this case? Like what specifically is the harm, the negative, sort of aspect of that loss? What specifically does a person have to go through? We say it's a loss, yes, but according to some interpretations of what happens in that case, what would it be? Okay, so one way of looking at it, Alicia, yes, is going to hell. And how bad is hell supposed to be? Hell's supposed to be the worst thing you could possibly imagine. It's like the reverse of heaven. So infinite pain and suffering. The descriptions of hell in these various major world religions are very brutal. It's like gnashing of teeth, and in some scriptures that I've read, they talk about, you're burning forever, and the skin is burned off, and you get new skin, it's burned again. So horrifying, just nightmarish, torture forever. That's terrible. On the same token, though, and Isaac, you're making a good point. Some people don't believe in the doctrine of hell, so some people think that it would at least be denial of heaven. And if that's the loss of heaven, it's still the loss of an infinitely happy afterlife. So it's the loss to infinity. It's like the greatest loss ever. It's either being deprived of heaven or even worse, being punished in hell. So that's horrible and bad. That's the worst loss you could suffer. Now, one last case. Say someone doesn't believe in God, and yeah, they were right. There is no God. So, I mean, you can say that's kind of like a win. It's like you took the position that ended up being correct, but what's the benefit here if there is any? Again, I mean, it's not much. It'd be like the converse of this. So you might get back the time and energy that other people have spent in their life practicing religion, which under this circumstance would have been a wasted effort. But now here we go. It's the final point. Looking at this little diagram, Pascal says it's clear that there's one of these two bets that's a much better bet than the other one. And I'm going to get to your commentary here in the chat in a moment. I like it that you guys are having that. But let me ask this question, though. It really brings it all together. Which bet is the better bet? What's the safer bet? Well, let me know what you think is the answer to that and tell me why. If this is to be believed, if this is the correct breakdown of possibilities and so forth, the outcomes paired together with choices, why would it be, as he argues, a way better, safer bet to just believe in God? We know that believing in God is claimed to be the better bet, but just I'd like you to explain, if you could expand on that. I mean, it's obvious in a way, but, and some of you have already hinted at it earlier in the chat, but why is the belief in God the better bet? Why is it? Keeping in mind that a better bet is one that has greater possibility for winning and less risk and exposure to loss. And so looking at that, why is one bet clearly superior to the other in terms of being safer and less risky for you? Okay, Alicia, because the outcomes are not as bad for belief as they are for non-belief. Yes, and we could be even more precise. Isaac, you say believing in God because the reward is infinitely higher than the possibility of being wrong and going to hell. You don't lose anything too major. Okay, these are all reasonable, good points. Let me just kind of bring them together and say it this way. River, you're also adding. Believing in God is, even if you're wrong, you're still in the same boat as those who didn't exist. Good way to put it, too. So it's kind of like, I would say it this way. When you believe in God, you really expose yourself to no big losses, because what's the worst that can happen? You're wrong. But if you're wrong, it's not like you're getting punished or you're losing on anything. Like, you just kind of maybe spend some additional time, and you might not have even minded doing that. So if you lose, you really lose nothing. But if you win everything. On the other hand, if you choose to believe that there's no God, then even if you're right, you really don't get anything. But if you're wrong, you get the worst loss of all. So it looks like one of these bets has a big upside without much risk. And the other one has no real upside, but a ton of risk. So he's saying if you're just rationally risk averse, it would be way more smart and sensible to just believe in God, because essentially you insure against the possibility of going to hell or being locked out of heaven, like a non-believer is taking a chance on that. A believer takes no risk in case they are wrong. A non-believer takes a huge risk with the condition of their immortal soul if it does exist. And so he says, why would you really take this dangerous risk when you have another bet that's right there, which holds no potential for risk or loss, and it just has this possible upside? Now, keep in mind all throughout here, he's not saying God exists, so you better believe in him, you don't want to go to hell. I mean, he's saying he might exist, he might not, and none of us know. But do you really want to take a chance on being wrong if you don't believe? If you don't believe and you're wrong, you have a huge loss facing you. And if you do believe and you're wrong, it's not a big deal. So he just says safer, smarter, less risky to believe. Now I'm seeing, let me go up to look at some of your guys' comments because I don't want to lose those things. What would it be like if you believed in God but the wrong religion? Okay, interesting question, Ismail. You know, he's writing to a Christian audience in like Europe in the 17th century, so I don't know if he thinks he's speaking to all members of all the major monotheistic world religions. But, you know, to sort of generalize, I guess you could say that belief in a God or deity who's like this creator that you should worship would possibly be a sufficient basis to win his favor. I don't know. I'm not sure. There have been people that have made that criticism. They've said, well, if you choose the wrong religious deity, then even belief might not meet with reward. And so why have we got this assurance coming from Pascal? That's a possibility. And going down a little further, I've heard that Mormonism is considered a cult because the Bible is rewritten, which is not allowed, and that all Mormons will go to hell. They still believe in God with two different books. Yeah, well, I mean, this is something I don't want to weigh in on. I mean, people have a lot of different religious views and beliefs. The credibility of them, the historical accuracy of them is something that people criticize and debate in history classes, in philosophy classes, and throughout the academy. In my mind, it's fair for there to be spin-off denominations of Christianity. Protestantism is itself diverted from the original just Catholic version of Christianity, which back then wasn't really called Catholicism, but just the Christian Church, Church of Christ. So I don't know. Yeah, whether, within the Book of Mormon, people who follow Mormonism and stuff, the Church of Latter-day Saints, they would probably hold that deviation from their interpretation of the Christian scripture is going to meet with like a divine punishment. But anyway, guys, yeah, so, and I also like what you said here, is it Spencer, that many of these arguments seem to assume God even cares what humans think. That's also a reasonable point. So hold on to your thoughts, guys, because we're going to learn about the criticism of this next time. So when we return next week, we're going to break down the criticisms of Pascal's wager, and that includes the article from W.K. Clifford and Robert McKim. So make sure you read those, and maybe also the Nicholas Everett article. It's just a couple pages, so it's not too long. And on Wednesday next week, when we come back after the holiday, we'll finish this topic of religion completely, and then we'll be moving on from that afterwards. And I'm also going to distribute the essay prompts this weekend too, so we'll talk about that after we get back. Okay, guys, I don't want to keep you anymore. I know it's a little past the time. So have a great day and a good weekend. If you need anything, feel free to message me, email me, and I'll be in touch between now and then. But keep an eye out for your titanium announcements, because I'm going to send off that prompt later in the weekend, maybe on Sunday or something. Okay, then. Have a good one, guys. Take care. Signing off, and I'll see you then in a little while. Okay, bye-bye.